Chapter 12, Part 3. So before we begin, before we move farther into this chapter, into spinal nerves, I wanted to show you this picture. And I found this on the internet. I love this picture. I think it is very cool. It's a microscopic image of an actual nerve. And you can see here, each of these blue things are axons, and those axons are wrapped in myelin sheath. And then you also see this bit of a covering here that is basically one of the connective tissue coverings surrounding the perineurium around the nerve itself. So I don't know how often you would have a chance to see this, but I just wanted to share it because when you put this bundle of axons together, then that makes a nerve. Like in the end, you know, when you look at a cadaver image and you see nerves in the arm or the leg or wherever, it's a bundle of these together that form that nerve. And so each of these is indicating an individual axon. So very cool, very exciting to me. I don't know if y'all think I'm just geeking out here, but I'll move on. So that image I just showed you is basically, you know, what this is showing here. Bundles of axons. It's got the, you know, when you look at this is actually layers of the Schwann cell having wrapped around that axon, which you can't see it very well here, but it is here. And then you see the connective tissue layers as well. Just like we have connective tissue layers around each individual muscle part, same thing with spinal nerves. You have the endoneurium, perineurium, and the epineurium. So endo surrounds individual neurons. The perineurium surrounds axon groups to form fascicles. So each individual fascicle group is surrounded by the perineurium, and the epineurium surrounds the entire nerve. All right, so organization of spinal nerves. So really important that you remember we have 31 pair. 31 pair of spinal nerves. Notice how I made this bigger, hoping that you would remember when we talk about cranial nerves, there's a different number of cranial nerves. So right now we're talking about the nerves coming off the spinal cord. So the first pair exit the vertebral column between the skull and the atlas, and the last four exit via the sacral foramina. Others exit through the intervertebral foramina, which is on either side of each vertebrae. There's 8 pairs of cervical nerves, 12 pairs of thoracic, 5 pairs of lumbar, 5 pairs of sacral, and 1 pair of coccygeal. So when you're trying to compare this to the vertebrae themselves, just remember that there are 8 cervical nerves, or 8 pair of cervical nerves that are branching out each side. Let me rephrase that. Yes, 8 pair going through each side, and it shows here. So that would be a total of 16. Okay, so anyway, so moving on from there, and you can see this image here. You're not going to have to label it, but you should know that there are 31 pair. So a dermatomal map. So you've probably somewhere along the lines, if you've ever been to maybe a chiropractor or a physical therapist or a neurosurgeon or something like that, maybe you've seen a dermatomal map. And basically, this map shows the spinal nerves and what area of the body those spinal nerves serve. So, or the skin area of the body that is served by any specific spinal nerve. So for me, I have issues with my C5, 6, and 7 discs and vertebrae where I have a pinched nerve, or had a pinched nerve. I've had surgery to have it fixed, but I had symptoms in my thumb, which would be associated with C6, my pointer finger, and my middle finger. I had a lot of symptoms in those, you know, over a period of time. And you can see that I didn't have any issues with my pinky or my ring finger. All of my issues were with the C5, 6, and 7 region. Or the the 7, 6, 7, and 8 region, basically. But my issues were 5, 6, and 7. But that's just interesting to me that they can say, okay, well, what fingers are affected? Oh, well, you definitely have something going on with your, 5, 6, and 7 in your neck. Let's take some images and see what's going on. And the same thing is if, you have issues with your leg. Like if you ever get up in the morning and suddenly you can't really pick up your foot, you're dragging your leg when you're walking. Obviously people might initially think maybe it's a stroke, but that's a pretty serious thing if you have something going on in your lumbar vertebrae that causes your leg to have severe weakness. So definitely, if that ever happens to you, get to a doctor right away. But the dermatomal map is basically a way for doctors to determine, if you're having an issue in a specific part of your body of numbness or tingling or whatever, they can help. That dermatomal map can help determine what area of the spinal cord might be involved. So definitely know what a dermatomal map is. So, branches of the spinal nerve. So, we have a dorsal ramus, they innervate, and when we say the word innervate, think of it as serving that area. It goes to that area, it fuels that area with signals, okay? So, a dorsal ramus innervate deep muscles of the trunk and is responsible for movements of the vertebral column and the connective tissue and skin near the midline of the back. The ventral ramus, what they innervate depends upon which part of the spinal cord is considered. So we have thoracic region, they form the intercostal nerves that innervate the intercostal muscles and skin over the thorax. And keep in mind that intercostal has to do with the ribs. So, or the rib area, the costal area means costal referring to ribs. The remaining spinal nerve, ventral rami, or the roots of the plexus, form 5 plexuses of intermingling nerves. We're going to talk more about this coming up. So we have the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, the lumbar plexus, the sacral plexus, and the coccygeal plexus. So there's a lot on this slide, but it's kind of leading you up to what we're about to talk about rather. So when we talk about a plexus or a plexi, I guess, a plexus is an intermingling or overlapping grouping of nerves that serve or innervate a specific part of the body. So the cervical plexus, and I'll be expecting you to know this, that we have the cervical, the brachial, the lumbar, and sacral. They usually group those together, but they are technically separate. And the coccygeal. So the cervical plexus is up in your upper neck, and it makes sense to me due to its location that it's going to innervate the skin of the neck and the posterior portion of the head, so the back of the head. So the cervical plexus coming off the spinal cord is going to serve the uppermost part of the body, not considering the face, okay, or the top of the head. So skin of the neck, posterior portion of the head, cervical plexus. The next portion down, and we're going to have some pictures coming up on this stuff, the brachial plexus innervates the shoulder and upper limb. And when you think about where the brachial area or the brachial region is, we think of brachial as that upper arm. So just remember the brachial plexus basically innervates. It comes from the spinal. It's the spinal nerves coming off of the spinal cord, and it branches into the shoulder and down into the arm. Lumbar and sacral plexes, or also known as lumbosacral, innervates the lower back, the hip, the lower abdomen, and the lower limbs. Makes sense to me because it's down to the bottom. All the way down, the coccygeal plexus innervates the muscles of the pelvic floor. So you can see here earlier I mentioned a cadaver with nerves. you can see here, you have these little rootlets coming off, and they form together to form spinal nerves, which you can see here sticking off. And you can see this illustration done here. And then here is the cervical plexus, and you can see coming off the neck, we have this grouping, this intermingling, this kind of braided in together grouping of nerves. And the cool thing about the plexus and the way the nerves are made up in the body, the way they're laid out, is that you can have, in some cases, a damage to a particular nerve in the body, and you may not have any major symptoms from that because of the way the nerves kind of branch off and then rebranch with each other farther down the line. It's really cool the way that happens. And if you look at this picture a little bigger, let me see if I can make it bigger here. You can see, and I've got to find the one. So this one here, this one that goes from up here to down here. Now, you're not going to have to memorize these. You don't have to know all the numbers. You don't have to know what they all serve. It's just good to know what's going on here. So this branches off of C2, and then it branches off of whatever nerve this is, the greater auricular nerve, and then it branches from the C3, and they lead together. So there's all this kind of branching, rebranching, reconnecting of these nerves, and that's what makes it, partly fascinating, and how you can have issues, but you cannot have major issues when there's damage to nerves. So one thing I want to mention about the cervical plexus that you will absolutely most likely be tested on is the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve is part of the cervical plexus. It's one of the nerves within the cervical plexus. And the phrenic nerve is super important in relation to the diaphragm. And so if the phrenic nerve on both sides is severed, then basically you stop breathing. So because the diaphragm is important muscle in relation to breathing. So make sure that you know the phrenic nerve is related to the cervical plexus, is part of the. All right, moving on to the brachial plexus. So the brachial plexus has a bunch of branches, and I'm not going to get too much into these branches other than to remind you that, and I thought I put this on here somewhere. Oh, I did. Yep. I'm sorry. That the brachial plexus, you need to remember that the brachial plexus innervates the shoulder and upper limb. Okay, so let me pop back to there. So on the test, I'm not going to ask you where the plexus originates from, but you should know that the brachial plexus has some branches, including the axillary, radial, musculocutaneous, ulnar, and median. And you can imagine, if you had to guess, that the radial nerve goes probably along the thumb side, the ulnar nerve probably goes along the pinky side, the median nerve probably goes towards the middle. I'm not going to test you on that, but if the axillary nerve probably goes somewhere into the armpit region. So it's just interesting the way these are named, and how you can kind of relate that to where it might be located. So again, here's another image, or here's an image of the brachial plexus. See how these are all intertwining, and they join up with each other. So the C5 and the C6 meet up at, this point, and then branch off, and then C6 joins up with C7, and then they all join up to C8. So you can imagine if you have some sort of a compression in here, it can cause some major issues. But if it's minor, then you may not. So the lumbar and sacral plexuses, again, what I mentioned earlier, that they are going to be related to the lower limb and the hip. I do have some things highlighted here.